Tilda, today we're going to look at not really Scottish people doing not very Scottish things in the middle of Scotland, where they've lived their whole lives. Now let me explain. Modern feminism is basically these days somewhat a clusterfuck of not true Scotsmen all pretending to be strawmen of each other. Anytime you pick a feminist out as an example of what feminism is, the feminist that you happen to be talking to will inevitably do the, well, that's not what actual feminism is, and then proceed to give you their definition of feminism, or just spout the good old dictionary definition at you. Which is rather amusing, because it basically seems these days that no one actually has a clue what actual feminism is, and that many feminists seem to dedicate a disproportionate amount of their time to writing articles like this: Feminism Myths That Need to Die. Now, while I appreciate the sentiment of this article, it's not actually doing what you seem to intend it to be doing. Now, that might sound a little bit weird, but let me elaborate for you. The intention here is to basically say that all the bad things about feminists, or about feminism, are myths. They're made up, they're false, and therefore anyone who proclaims to be a feminist, who mentions any of these things, aren't actual feminists. But this article title kind of gets around doing the actual call-out, finger-point, you're not a real feminist thing by simply saying that these are myths around feminism. So it's a kind of roundabout way of saying you're not a feminist without actually having to say you're not a feminist and take that very definite hardline stance, which is increasingly necessary if feminists actually did want to somehow try and save their ideology from the infestation of crazies that are in it. Personally, I think it's beyond salvaging at this point, but maybe that's just me. So I appreciate the sentiment, I just think your way of going about it is absolutely terrible. And to just highlight how not very Scottish these mythological feminist strawmen are, I am going to counter every single point that this article makes by citing feminists. Because myths and stereotypes don't come out of nowhere. Sure, they may be exaggerations, they may be extrapolations, they may be out-of-context quotes, but they do all start from somewhere. So let's get stuck in there, shall we? I can't wait for all the feminists who watch this video who disagree with me to start pointing out that all the feminists I'm sourcing aren't actual feminists, and thus totally proving my point. Everybody is talking about feminism nowadays, but there are lots of misconceptions about what it really means to be a feminist. Some of those notions are more damaging than others because they discourage people from identifying as feminist, which is really about supporting equality for women, and who doesn't want that? Honestly, you might as well have just put the dictionary definition in quotes there. Also, I'd like to point out to you that believing that women should be treated equally to men, as in they should be given equal opportunity to prove themselves within society, is not the exclusive domain of feminism. There are other philosophies and ideologies that also hold that as one of their core tenets, such as certain types of egalitarianism and humanism. There's another reason why I'm not particularly fond of feminism, and why a lot of people aren't. You just seem to need people to apply that label to themselves when they believe that same thing, but just don't call themselves that. But you have to convert them to your label because reasons. Here are some common myths about feminism that we must retire immediately. Well, I'm glad you've taken it upon yourself to talk for all feminists. So I guess we know who the new pope is. 1. Feminists are unattractive. When certain people think of feminists, they come up with images of bra-burning and hairy legs and armpits, and argue that feminists are ugly. But that's such an unfair description that noted feminist Jessica Valenti tweeted this in response. For decades now, the best comeback sexists have is, "You're ugly." If that's not a sign of being on a losing team, I don't know what is. Attacking a woman on her looks is not just boring, it assumes everyone else is as superficial as you are. The reality is that feminists come in all shapes, sizes, and appearances. A person's physical attributes do not determine whether or not that individual is a feminist. First of all, citing Jessica Valenti as a good example of a feminist. You know, the woman who will actively discount the emotional vulnerabilities and needs of men by quite unironically standing in her male tears t-shirts and drinking from her male tears mugs. Something kind of amusing there when we constantly hear feminists talk about how feminism is totally for men too. And then Jessica will quite happily go on record here saying feminists don't hate men, but it wouldn't matter if we did. As in, it's totally fine for feminists to hate men. This is your example of a good feminist that you want to be quoting, right? Sure. Whatever. As for this notion that feminists are unattractive, well, over the years we have seen numerous examples of feminists who are just physically repulsive. In some cases, not only physically, but also in attitude. Just vile, loud, obnoxious, aggressive. Sure, there are attractive women out there who are feminists. There are attractive celebrities out there who claim to be feminists, although we don't necessarily actually know if they are or not, or whether they were simply bullied into their position. But this is a stereotype that has come about because of reality, and that is an inescapable fact. There's a reason why, when Goodfella held his Draw a Feminist contest, there was a remarkable number of entries coming in with large hairy armpits, neon-dyed coloured hair, overweight, with multiple facial piercings. Because this is the face of so many modern feminists that we actually see. Now, you can point and say they are just the vocal minority, but they are still feminists. Next. 2. Stay-at-home mums can't be feminists. Although some argue otherwise, well, it's nice of you to put that in there because you've kind of done a little bit of my work for me, but moving on. Staying at home with the kids doesn't mean you're not a feminist. The Miss Foundation recently called for a more inclusive feminist movement with the hashtag MyFeminismIs, and writer Heather Wood Rudolph championed the same thing in a stay-at-home mum piece for the Huffington Post several years ago. Women who choose to go back to work after a baby, or those who don't have any choice but to, are not better feminists than I am, she wrote. And this is why feminism needs to be, and is, a flexible ideology. It's inclusive, because we all need it. Rudolph also took issue with writer Elizabeth Wurzel's Atlantic piece that argued that wealthy housewives hurt the feminist movement. Wurzel's picture of a perfect feminist is this: a woman who gets an advanced degree, works in a prestigious field, never marries, and certainly doesn't stay home with children, if she decides to have them, which she probably won't. Rudolph wrote, "This antiquated vision of feminism is the real problem with the movement today, insofar as the more people who think this, the less informed participants feminism has." I'm just going to read a short excerpt here from The Book and the Right by Maynard Miller, which covers the view of various feminists not only on stay-at-home mothers, but also just on the concept of family altogether. Feminists, in their campaign, are the modern heirs of Marxist thought, in which the natural family is an impediment in the pursuit of the utopian socialist goal. So taking their signals from Marxist doctrine, they have formulated their anti-family views. Gloria Steinem said, "We have to abolish and reform the institution of marriage. By the year 2000 we will, I hope, raise our children to believe in human potential, not God. We must understand what we are attempting is a revolution, not a public relations movement." Feminist Toni Morrison agreed, saying, "The little nuclear family is a paradigm that just doesn't work. It doesn't work for white people or for black people. Why are we hanging on to it? I don't know." Mary Jo Bain, an academic, stated, "In order to raise children with quality, we must take them away from families and communally raise them." Vivian Gornick echoes the same script. "Being a housewife is an illegitimate profession. The choice to serve and be protected and plan towards being a family maker is a choice that shouldn't be. The heart of radical feminism is to change that." Linda Gordon, another radical feminist, reflects the same thinking when she says the nuclear family must be destroyed, and the people must find better ways of living together. Whatever its ultimate meaning, the breakup of families now is an objectively revolutionary process. Families have supported oppression by separating into small, isolated units unable to join together to fight for common interests. So those are the opinions of a good half-dozen feminists on the concept of the family as a whole. And it's kind of difficult to be a stay-at-home mum when they want to completely destroy the concept of family altogether. Then there's the piece that you yourself linked, stating, women must be financially independent to thrive. You cannot choose to be financially dependent on a man and also call yourself a feminist. Unsurprisingly written by a feminist. And then we have Jezebel, who will just tell us that the feminist housewife is such bullshit. Again, this isn't really a myth. This is a notion that people have because it has been born out of reality. Now, I can already hear it echoing over the hills, not all feminists, but that doesn't stop these particular women from being feminists. Next, 3. Taking your husband's last name is anti-feminist. It's not unusual for feminists to keep their maiden names after getting married, but taking your husband's last name doesn't make you any less of a feminist. Last year, in a piece for Verily magazine, writer and self-proclaimed feminist Mary Rosa Somariba explained her decision to take her spouse's name. I did so because I like the sound of it, she wrote. I like the consistency for me and my family, and the fact that I will have the same last name as my children. Even though I had established a professional byline with my maiden name, I thought, it's a new start. Some women, such as pop sensation Beyoncé, hyphenate their last names after getting married. There's no one-size-fits-all choice, and there's so much more to feminism than one's last name. So this was a rather interesting one, and actually quite difficult to find a feminist who had spoken specifically against this. And after all, that is the challenge for this video. But I did it. Jill Filipovic, writing in The Guardian, why should married women change their names? Let men change theirs. And she spoke a little bit more about this article and went a bit more in-depth into it on a website called feminista.us. So I think it's a reasonable assumption that she's a feminist. And let's head on down to the paragraph where she actually expresses her opinions around women changing their names. I'm not unsympathetic to the women out there who have difficult or unfortunate last names. My last name is Filipovic. People can't spell it or pronounce it, which is a liability when your job includes writing articles under your difficult-to-spell last name, and occasionally doing television or radio hits where the host cannot figure out what to call you. It's weird and it's ethnic, and it makes me too easily Googleable. But Jill Filipovic is my name and my identity. Jill Smith is a different person. That is fundamentally why I oppose changing your name, and why I look forward to the wider legalization of same-sex marriage, which in addition to just being good and right, will challenge the idea that there are naturally different roles for men and women within the marital unit. Identities matter, and the words we put on things are part of how we make them real. There's a power in naming that feminists and social justice activists have long highlighted. Putting a word to the most obvious social dynamics is the first step towards ending inequality. Words like sexism and racism, my God, we've heard those enough from social justice feminists, make clear that different treatment based on sex or race is something other than the natural state of things. The invention of the term miss shed light on the fact that men simply existed in the world while women are identified based on their marital status. Your name is your identity. The term for you is what situates you in the world. The cultural assumption that women will change their names upon marriage, the assumption that we'll even think about it and be in a position where we make a choice of whether to keep our names or take our husbands, cannot be without consequence. Part of how our brains function and make sense of a vast and confusing universe is by naming and categorizing. When women see our names as temporary or not really ours, and when we understand that part of being a woman is subsuming your own identity into your husband's, that impacts our perception of ourselves and our role in the world. It lessens the belief that our existence is valuable unto itself, and that as individuals we are already whole. It disassociates us from ourselves and feeds into a female understanding of self as relational. We are not simply who we are defined by our role as someone's wife or mother or daughter or sister. So basically, she thinks that if you change your name, you somehow cease being yourself, or you lose part of your identity or something, which kind of ignores the fact that any aspect of your name was always given to you by someone else anyway, and that therefore the only way for you to truly define yourself would be for you to create your own name. But that's another whole load of nonsense altogether. So I was actually able to find a feminist who specifically spoke out against this, but what I'm more interested in is, where do you think this stereotype came from? Because I deal with feminists a lot on this channel, and I have never heard any feminist talk about taking your husband's last name or not taking your husband's last name, or anything to do with this being a myth surrounding feminism. So I'd be more intrigued to know where this author got this idea that this is a myth about feminism from. Oh well. Next. 4. Feminists can't love cooking or cleaning or anything domestic. Cooking and chores can be a lot of work, but if you like these things, you're not a bad feminist. Humans are complicated beings, and it's totally okay to enjoy making delicious food after a long day of fulfilling intellectually stimulating work. Research has shown that cleaning and cooking can improve one's mental health, so you shouldn't feel like you have to deprive yourself of these things to maintain your standing as a feminist. Homemaking and caring for the person you're making that home with and feminism are not only allowed to coexist, they easily go hand in hand. Bustles, Kate George wrote earlier this year. You're allowed to be a domestic goddess living in cohabited bliss while still fighting the good fight. You're just fighting it from the luxury of a freshly bleached bathroom floor and a lovingly prepared 8-hour stew. Now, this was quite an interesting one to try and find a feminist to speak out against it, until I realised that actually the overwhelming majority of feminists already do, because patriarchy and internalised misogyny. That is, of course, the patriarchy that we keep hearing feminists talk about, the term used to describe society as we live in today, you know, the one where women are systematically disadvantaged and oppressed, somehow. I have yet to find any actual compelling objective evidence of this, but we're going to assume that this is true for the sake of the argument, because this is what feminists actually believe. And that part of this historical and social oppression of women has, of course, been limiting their political power and keeping them working within the domestic sphere. In other words, bitch, shut up and make me a sandwich. And then we come to the wonderful feminist term of internalized misogyny. The idea that women, hearing these sorts of sexist messages and taking them into themselves, internalize them and reinforce them all on their own, thus perpetuating their own oppression in society by believing that the only thing they are supposed to do with their lives is to exist within the domestic sphere. So any feminist who speaks about patriarchy, any feminist who speaks about internalized misogyny, could only ever logically come to the conclusion that if you are a woman who enjoys cooking or enjoys cleaning or enjoys any sort of domestic work at all, then you have simply internalized the sexist message of the patriarchy. And that logically, if you therefore wanted to be a good feminist, you would have to smash the patriarchy, of course. So following this chain of rhetoric that we hear from feminists day in and day out, actually, a feminist shouldn't be able to enjoy these things. But that is, of course, attempting to follow what feminism says from a logical step-by-step standpoint, and we know that feminists are incapable of doing such things. So while I couldn't actually find a specific feminist speaking out against this, it actually seems to be built in to the very patriarchy rhetoric that we hear so many of them talk about. And as we all know, cooking and cleaning is certainly a part of caregiving, so off you go, Big Red.
The assumption that women are naturally better caregivers is part of patriarchy.
And finally, point number 5. Men can't be feminists. Not all men are uncomfortable with the notion of feminism, and some happily embrace it. Orange is the New Black actor Matt McGorry is a great example of a male feminist, and he's far from alone. Consider Mick's Flip the Script video below. Earlier this year, Mick's senior editor and well-known feminist Elizabeth Plank met up with McGorry in Los Angeles to discuss his views on feminism. Yes, you did right, 2 discusses. Moving on, Plank said that Magori used to be a bodybuilder, and that she finds it interesting to see someone with a hypermasculine background label himself as a feminist. You play a man's man on television, but in your free time you read Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, Plank said. Don't you feel like you're lying to your fans? I think that having some traits that are traditionally masculine doesn't exclude me from wanting gender equality, he said. I don't think they're mutually exclusive things. I think it benefits everyone to be feminist. Yes, I like how the author there had to add in the "to be feminist" at the end. But now enter feminist Karen Ingala Smith, who will write, "Thanks and all, but no thanks, I don't want men in my feminism." Yes, I'm one of those feminists who doesn't want men in feminism, the type who doesn't think men can be feminists. I'm quite happy to talk with you, work in partnership with or alongside you, even count a select bunch of you amongst my friends, but call you feminists? Nah. And then there's the concept of male allies from the Vegan Feminist Network. Many feminists insist that men can't be feminists, and the National Organization of Men Against Sexism agrees. To be feminist is to be a self-identified woman fighting for female equality. To be a feminist requires a direct experience of gender oppression, because it is in this unique experience as a member of the targeted group that you will inform activism. Men who become disgruntled with this definition and demand inclusion only underscore the ubiquitousness of male privilege. When men reassert their entitlement, they are demonstrating their need to be in control, and they are demonstrating patriarchy. While men can never fully remove themselves from their privileges of their gender, men can absolutely be allies. And this entire concept of men as allies is quite interesting in feminism. And it's a term that we hear over and over again about all the ways that men can be feminist allies. Never full-blown feminists, but just allies to feminists. Almost as if feminism, from the very get-go, sets men up as second-class citizens within its own ideology, where they can never truly possess full feminist status. They are always the tier below. They may ally themselves to feminists, they may support feminists, but they can never truly be a feminist. So, apologies to the author of this article. This is not a myth. This is reality. And here ends the game, which you just lost if you're playing. The reason that these supposed myths around feminism exist is because they are reality. They're not mythical stereotypes that need to go away because there's no truth to them. The truth behind many of these ideas is very much alive and well, and quite easily observable in modern feminism. And I already know the response that feminists are going to give this. The feminists you found aren't real feminists. You're just building a straw man of what feminism is. The dictionary definition of feminism is, you're just cherry-picking. Vocal minority. The problem is that any one of those responses, or anything along those lines, only actually serves to prove my point that I was making at the beginning. No feminist is ever the one true Scotsman. Yes, we know, not all feminists are like that. But the reality is, enough of them are.